So this lecture is on the Eisenhower years, 1952 to 1960, Dwight Eisenhower. It is a polarized time period, as you can see by the images I've included here, these kind of idyllic, stereotypical images of picnics and people happy, obviously here white people. But also this is the period where Emmett Till is murdered, a black kid from Chicago visiting Mississippi. It is a time period where, as you see here, race mixing is communism. The civil rights movement is really beginning to take off, especially 1955 on. And a lot of people, white Americans, are very resistant to this. And they associate it with communism because, again, what are civil rights leaders asking for? Equality. And equality sounds a lot like communism. And then here, this for Southern California folks, this is the forced evictions of people who lived in Chavez Ravine, which is now the site of the Dodger Stadium. So a very polarized time period. I want to go through and indulge me, if you will, look at some electoral maps from the 1950s until the modern period. So basically all of periods, APUSH period 7. In 1952 election, Eisenhower is elected. We know this is the first time a Republican has won the presidential elections in 20 years. The Congress became Republican majority in the mid to late 40s, but this is the first time that the executive is also a Republican. Adlai Stevenson we'll learn more about later, but we know Eisenhower wins. He's a war vet. We'll learn more about that. Okay, 1956, Eisenhower wins re-election. Again, Eisenhower is a Republican. The South is not they are not big fans of Republicans, right? The party of Lincoln is not a party that a lot of white people, white Southerners are going to vote for in the South. Black Southerners obviously would like to, but they, because of grandfather clauses and poll taxes and literacy tests and all those shenanigans, they can't vote. 1960, things get a little split up here. Kennedy wins. Nixon doesn't. We'll learn more about that in the next lecture and why that happens. Again, Democrats elsewhere, obviously Kennedy is from New England, so he takes the Northeast. But he's a rather, he's young, he's progressive, and he wins. He's assassinated. 1964, Lyndon Johnson runs, right, because he is the vice president. And suddenly you have this kind of incredible shift of the South, a region that had always been the base of the Democratic Party, all the way back to, you name it, really, Andrew Jackson and on. Certainly the Civil War proves that. Now suddenly they're voting for Barry Goldwater, who's from Arizona. Again, Arizona being a Sun Belt state, Goldwater being a product of Sun Belt politics. Goldwater is what we might call kind of a libertarian, very, very dedicated to states' rights, small government, et cetera, et cetera. Why might the South like the idea of states' rights in 1964? Because Lyndon Johnson, a Southerner from Texas, voted for the Civil Rights Act, which is seen as a huge betrayal to Southerners. So while even only 4 years earlier, the South is all Democrat, 8 years earlier, all Democrat in 52, suddenly there's this change to states' rights becoming a very appealing sounding stand-in for pro-segregation. Again, we hear the discourse of states' rights in the lead up to the Civil War as well, right? And it raises the question of a states' right to what? A states' right to, for in the case of the 1860s, that is to maintain slavery, In the case of the 1960s, it is a state's rights to maintain segregation. We move forward to 68. If you had any doubts about this, what I'm saying in 64, we can put paid to that doubt by looking at the electoral map here, in which George Wallace, ardent states' rights and adamantly pro-segregation candidate, wins the South as an independent. So if we had any, if we were dubious about the idea that this was about segregation, Wallace in 68 really proves that it's about segregation. Wallace doesn't win. Hubert Humphreys, the Democrat, does not win. Nixon wins. Nixon is the vice presidential candidate all the way back in 52. Nixon is a very interesting political figure. I'll talk more about him. Maybe one of the most interesting political figures in modern American politics. 72, Nixon wins in a landslide against the too liberal, some said, George McGovern, idealistic, left-leaning candidate, gets smoked by Richard Nixon in a re-election campaign. Nixon, of course, is going to be impeached, but resigns. Gerald Ford in 76 takes over. He is not a popular candidate. People on both sides of the political spectrum don't like him because on the one hand, he pardons Richard Nixon. On the other hand, he pardons draft dodgers and deserters. So not a big American public, not a fan of him. And we have, again, the South going Democrat. Carter is from Georgia, and no one likes Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford is from Michigan. Fun fact. Or not so fun fact because he doesn't win re-election. 1980, Reagan wins. You'll see here in 76, you have Reagan here also running. Reagan primaried Gerald Ford, saw him as a very weak candidate, and went into the primaries and challenged him. Doesn't beat him out in the primaries, but runs also as a Republican and doesn't win. He wins a landslide in 1980, and this kind of creates the modern kind of Reagan revolution, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so that's the electoral map. Just to kind of go through, I mean, people talk about the quote-unquote parties switching. I think that's, it's not true, but not for the reasons that often people say it's not true. Much of the ideologies kind of did shift back and forth, right? States' rights, states' rights, states' rights. From the 1860s to the early 1960s, that's a Democratic thing. After 1964, definitely after 1968, that becomes a Republican talking point. And it's about segregation. It's manifestly about segregation. Okay, back in time to 1952, Eisenhower. Just quickly going over his resume. He is no slouch. He's born in the late 19th century. He's from Kansas, big family. He's good at sports. He's good at Army stuff. He is a real good candidate, right? So this, again, you look at resumes of potential presidential candidates. Madison is up there. Eisenhower is up there. Pretty good resume. Again, the 1950s, as you learned from the Atomic Cafe video, nuclear threat is always in the background. The war in Korea, the Red Scare. What is the Red Scare or McCarthyism? It's not just Joseph McCarthy. He's the prominent leader of, obviously, the eponymous movement, McCarthyism. But it's also the corporate world wanting to rid political and payroll ranks of communists, right? This becomes a pushback against the New Deal in general. Corporate America never liked the New Deal policies of more regulation and more government control. So this is an easy way to say, look, it's not that I don't like Democrats, I don't like communists. And suddenly your argument becomes much more compelling. And then also the House of Reps in general. Soviet Union and the United States are the two world powers. And then within the United States, we have, again, as I said at the intro, two Americas. One is white, prosperous, the kind of happy days, rock and roll, I Love Lucy. And then the other side is one of people of color advocating for civil rights, massive anti-civil rights violence, right? Most prominently, right? although many examples of kind of white supremacist terror. Emmett Till is kind of one of the major ones. Rosa Parks, the sit-ins, Mendez versus Westminster, Supreme Court case in Southern California, Westminster, California, which is a precedent for the Brown versus Board decision, which comes later in the decade. So a divided time. Okay, back to the election of 52 again. Television plays a role for the first time. Stevenson is a classic politically connected guy. He loses. The Republican platform, which they test out in 52 and stick with, really, really until now. I mean, even in the upcoming election of 2020, it would be interesting to see how much rhetoric of anti-communism goes on, even though communism is really not. It's a marginal political ideology, at least internationally, right? Eisenhower wants a kind of modern republicanism. He's weird in this sense in terms of post-New Deal Republican presidents. He is certainly the most moderate. After Eisenhower, they become increasingly further to the right, where Eisenhower doesn't want to dismantle the New Deal. He says, look, we fought that fight. It's over. People like these programs. I'm not going to eviscerate the Rooseveltian New Deal. Let's just go with it. But he does want to balance the budget, right? Be a little bit more conservative, as it were, with spending, all of that. How can he do both? How can he both expand government programs and balance the budget? A incredibly productive economy. So that's how you do that. I mean, again, there's very few time periods in the modern era that are like this. Most recently, the kind of pre-dot-com bust. But the 1950s also a very hot economy. He wins big time. And again, as I said, ends 20 years of Democratic control. Richard Nixon, more on him later. He's an outsider. He's from Whittier, California, which as far as Washington, D.C. politics goes, might as well be Jupiter. It's the middle of nowhere. But again, it is where? It is the Sun Belt. Goldwater from Arizona is very, very important to the modern conservative movement. Eisenhower from Southern California, very important to the modern conservative movement. And then, of course, the last in the holy trilogy of modern conservatism is Reagan, who is also, right, obviously from Southern California. He's put on the ticket because he's more conservative than Eisenhower. He's made famous, right, because of his anti-communism. He will talk about this Checker speech. You can watch a video later on that. Eisenhower's leadership style, a lot of people criticize him for he looks like he's just playing golf all the time. That is not the case. He delegates authority. He's actually a very, very good leader in terms of giving people very clear roles, empowering them to do those roles and trusting them. And then he can kind of, sit back and trust that the chain of a command will be followed. The nickname of his cabinet was 9 Millionaires and a Plumber. The plumber was the Democrat. The plumber was also the one that resigned. He pushed for reforming the Taft-Hartley Act, which was a union-busting act. That doesn't happen, so he resigns. One of the most famous things to happen, at least domestically, in Eisenhower's presidency is the National Interstate Highway Act. If you're familiar with the movie Cars, right? When they build the highway, people stop driving through Radiator Springs. This is the fate of a lot of small towns that relied on people just driving through their little towns. When the interstate highway is built, commerce becomes a lot more efficient, a lot faster. You need that infrastructure to have a solid economy. And again, he's a Republican. This is not a Roosevelt thing. He's a Republican saying, look, some of the ideas here about the government getting involved, who's going to build this in the private sector? Is there a private company that's going to build a national interstate highway? Absolutely not. It's the role of government to do that. So he is, in some ways, very much inspired by the best practices, as it were, of the Roosevelt administration. 56, he suffers a heart attack. It's seen as, oh, maybe he shouldn't run. Does he have good health? But he's still very popular. The economy is doing really well. They didn't like, look, you know, political note to Democrats, right? If they didn't vote for the person the first time around, they're probably not going to vote for the person the second time around. If the American public doesn't like them the first time, they're not going to like them the second time. And indeed, Eisenhower wins with an even bigger margin than 52. Just very quickly, most of the Eisenhower stuff, when you think about, sure, the National Highway Act is important, but most of the things, when we think of the major events of the Eisenhower administration, it is foreign policy, international crises arising from the Cold War. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, like Dulles Airport in Texas, is the major figure in shaping Eisenhower's foreign policy. Eisenhower doesn't like this policy of containment, right? This is, again, the idea of Democrats being too soft on communism. This is a big part of it. Look, don't just contain. You've got to take the fight to communists and stop the spread, not just through putting up roadblocks, but going in and being more proactive. And that's exactly what Dulles does. We have this idea of Dulles is brinksmanship, pushing the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of war. That's where we get the term brinksmanship, effectively playing a kind of global nuclear chicken match and saying who will flinch first. And Dulles's theory being, look, we have more nukes and we have more superiority in terms of our technology. They're going to flinch first, so let's just push us to the brink. A lot of people were very critical of this, obviously. Would not have been good had he calculated wrong. This is the phrase bang for the buck. You've heard people say, oh, get more bang for your buck. This is exactly what it means. It means literal bang for your buck. So invest more in nukes as opposed to, amphibious landing vehicles or some kind of thing, which are expensive, but don't give you that explosive factor. The map here in the background you see in blue is what we would call the first world. In red is the second world, or communist nations, and then the green is non-aligned or third world nations. So the term first world and third world is still with us to some degree, and it's very much rooted in the Cold War. So the first world was the capitalist nations, the second world was the communist nations, and then the third world was the nations that were effectively the kind of the battleground between the first and the second world. Let's get some perspective here. If you think back to what you've learned, maybe either in period 7 of APUSH or AP World or Modern World, much of the third world, right, outlined here in green, is colonized by Europe or the United States. A lot of the people that live there aren't very happy about that. They are economically exploited. The resources and wealth from their countries they see as being shipped off to London or to Paris or to Washington, D.C. or whatever. And suddenly someone gives them, as I said, someone gives them a copy of the Communist Manifesto and AK-47, at least after 1947 when it's invented. And they go, oh yeah, this makes sense to me. So a lot of the Cold War conflict is about the wake of imperialism, the wake of period 7, the effects of the scramble for Africa, all of this. And a lot of these nations, so African nations that are colonized by France, fight for their independence, and then they don't get recognized by France as a trading partner. They don't get recognized by other European nations. They don't get recognized by the United States because France says, do not recognize the Congo or something like that. So where do they turn for aid? The Soviet Union. And this is a kind of time and again what we see here is these countries becoming pawns in this larger imperial conflict between the capitalist world and the communist world. As in Southeast Asia, or Asia in general, Korea is in East Asia, Indochina, Southeast Asia. After World War II, the French want their colonies back. The colonized fight back. In 55 is when the French finally lose at Dien Bien Phu. That's when the United States go from just funding the containment theory to actually fighting in Southeast Asia. More on that next time. Great Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Thailand, Pakistan, and the United States form this 8-nation SEATO, 8-nation defense pact to, again, prevent the spread of communism. So that is in Asia. In the Middle East, the United States and England are in a difficult position. They need oil, so they need to maintain friendly relations with countries like Israel and Egypt, but they also want to support, not Israel, Egypt and Iran, but they also want to support Israel, newly created in 1940, 46, 47, 48, which is one of the last kind of the parting. The parting shot of the British Empire is to create the State of Israel and divide Pakistan and India. Obviously, two political decisions that have ongoing consequences even into the modern period. So what do? In Egypt, President Gamal al-Nasser wants to build a dam along the Nile. He doesn't get the aid because he is not supportive of the State of Israel. So he turns to the Soviets. He takes over the Suez Canal and is then deposed by, really Israel, right? Israel launches a surprise attack. They retake the canal. Nasser is not deposed, but his seizing of the canal doesn't work. The United States is actually shocked because the United States doesn't know anything about this. They're surprised when they hear about this happening, so they're a little irked by that. On the other hand, the United States is very involved in Iran, getting rid of Mohammad Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh is popularly elected in 1953. He is a socialist. He supports a secular democracy, kind of very modern take on governance. Part of his socialism is saying, well, why does England get all the wealth from our oil reserves? We're going to seize the holdings of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and that money is going to be used for Persians. England doesn't like that. The United States doesn't like that. They overthrow him in 53 and install the Shah Reza Pahlavi, and more on that later when we look at the 1979 revolution in Iran. Eisenhower Doctrine is, again, like Truman Doctrine is containment. Eisenhower Doctrine is helping to fight back communism through funding some countries in the Middle East. In this time period, the United States overtakes France and Great Britain as the leading Western or the leading power really in global diplomacy. Interestingly, this is a time period from 1900 to 1960. Pre-1900, if you were a diplomat or you wanted to be involved in foreign relations, well, you had to be rich, for one, but also you had to speak French, because France was the most important kind of international player in the world. This changes to having to speak English, right, after World War II. Nikita Khrushchev is, you see him here, he's holding chickens, he's eating corn, he's drinking beer, he's hugging Castro. He's elected in 56, as opposed to, if you remember, the guy he replaced. Effectively, there was one guy before him, but the real one he replaces is Stalin. The hope is that he's going to have more peace with the West. He actually comes to the United States and goes on a kind of tour of the country. He's really, really popular. Even though the United States is very anti-communist, they see in Khrushchev a guy that they really kind of identify, a lot of Americans identify with. He grew up poor, he grew up rural, He knew about farming. He wasn't afraid, obviously, to kind of go out there and grab a chicken or a pig or corn. So he kind of had a down-home, folksy quality that was really a big PR boon for the Soviets. All that ends with the U-2 incident, right? Gary Powers is captured when they shoot down the Soviets shoot down his spy plane, which was taking pictures of Soviet bases. Just to get a sense of what a U-2 spy plane, what we're talking about here. It's not. It wasn't shot down at cruising altitude. It was shot down while it was taking off, because the cruising altitude of a U-2 is 70,000 feet. Just to give you a kind of sense, a commercial airline, if you fly somewhere, generally flies at 35 to 40,000 feet. So it's like you're not going to shoot one down that high up. But they knew where the U-2s were taking off from, so the Soviets shot it down as it was ascending. And this kind of ends the period of a potential thaw, and then we're jumped back into the Cold War again. Okay, that is all for the Eisenhower years. Again, key takeaways here being a polarized domestic scene and a increasingly aggressive foreign policy stance towards the Soviets.